If you deny it or not, everyone has an ego, right? A lot of people think they don't have an ego, but I think when they say they don't have an ego, they probably do. So, how do you know when your ego is getting in the way of team success or group success, company success?
Yeah, like I think like you think of a team meeting, and sometimes you're sitting there and you're like, I kind of have the solution here. Like, let's just move on to the next thing. But I think you got to step back and let everyone sort of contribute, right, to whatever the issue is at hand or whatever you're talking about. Like, I think taking that step back to check your ego, to let others contribute, I think it just helps, like, as a whole, right? And I think it's a long-term thing too. It's like looking long, sorry, in terms of team success, right? That everyone feels like they can contribute, that you're not constantly monopolizing a team meeting or a situation, right?
Interesting you mentioned that, because I think that's a very common thing you mentioned, Sanjay.
Yeah.
Where someone feels because they have the title, they have the respect, or they just have the ego that their opinion counts the most, or they know the most, or they generally know the most, right? Like often the person knows the most. They have the most experience in that subject or in that company or in that industry. What do you do in that case when we're talking about something and you're the expert there? We're making rookie mistakes, and our assessments aren't like, there are things that you already thought about. You're like 5 steps ahead. How do you handle that situation?
So I think there's two things. There's a team meeting like situation where you might have a lot more juniors at the meeting, right? And I think the way that you kind of combat that is you kind of ask a question, right? You poke holes in what they're saying, right? Let them come to that conclusion on their own. Oh yeah, maybe that wasn't the best way to do it, or maybe there's a way we can tighten this up. I think when you're in a team meeting of peers, I'm not going to be the smartest person at the table. I'm not going to be an expert in every aspect of whatever the subject is, right? The guy that used to head up our group, he retired, but he kind of made this in one of his speeches in his last year with us. He said, "I'm only successful because I've hired the right people around me."
Right.
Right? Perfect example of checking your ego.
Yep.
Right? I'm not an expert at every single thing that I manage, but I've hired the people who are. Right? And right there, for him to come out in front of the entire line of business, they'd be like, yeah, but that's okay. It's okay not to know everything,
Sure.
right? But I've created the team around me that does. Together, like we're gonna go crush it. Right?
Not to derail the conversation too much, I think still kind of parallel to this conversation. What happens in a situation where there is an expert, but a junior, right? They may or may not know what they're talking about, but they feel really strongly about like a subject. Again, they're a junior. You're clearly above them in the food chain. How do you handle that situation? So one of my past bosses, he taught me one of the best things, because I used the approach at one time where he had me doing something. He's like, "Hey Z, I want you to go and do this. This is what the decision is." So I went, and this is when maybe about 10 years ago. I wasn't as confident. I went in, I talked to the team and said, "Hey guys, this is what we have to do." Try to kind of just repeat the words that my boss said, and it was something that no one wanted to really do. So they kind of talked me out of it, right? So I'm like, okay, let's just do what you guys said, right? Because it was 7 people that wanted to do it a different way. So the next day, I didn't want to bring it up to my boss because I knew that if I did, he would be upset. So I just kind of tried to sweep it under the rug. And then 2-3 days later, maybe that same day, he found out that what he asked for, we didn't do. And then I was trying to make that argument to my boss saying, "Well, boss," I'm not going to say his name. He knows who he is. He's the best boss I ever had. No, literally, he was amazing. He taught me so many things. But basically, he told me one of the best lessons in business. He goes, "Business is not a democracy, right? It's nice that 7 people wanted to do it at a different way, but how do you know that they know more or they know better, right? How do you know I faced a situation before, right? So I want you to go back and tell them that this is the decision." So I had to go, and somehow I had that uncomfortable conversation. But the point here was, this was a time where the boss ended up being right, and it was good that he overruled me multiple times, and overruled the team to kind of get his way, right?
So are you saying with that boss, his ego contributed to the team's success?
I don't know if his ego did, but I think his knowledge did, and his also his strong voice. So I think there's a like, what's better in business? 7 people wanted it one way, but it ends up being the wrong decision. It cost more money, or lost customers, or whatever the net impact was, and the it was one person's say, and that one, it contributed to more success overall. Do you think it's better that 7 people got their way, but less, like a worse result, or is it better to have the ultimate result, but getting it the way the
No,
boss wanted?
I think when you're talking about, like, you got an expert in the room, or like you have someone that's really seasoned in the business relative to the others, and I think they're like, hey, I've been here, done that before, many times before, so I'll tell you how this goes. I think you can rein it in, but I think you also do need to give your team the ability to voice their thoughts, right? Because here's the reality: is like, and I'm a firm believer of this. You can learn something from everybody, even your kids, right?
Absolutely.
So to shut them out just because you have 20 years of experience on them, I think is like, it's going back to ego, right? The question's about ego,
Sure.
right? I think that's where, hey, like, that's a great thought, Z. But here's the thing: I've seen this before. A couple of years ago, we had the exact same thing, and we did this approach. This is how it rolled out. It didn't roll out really well, and you'd probably be like, okay, that's good to know. Maybe let me rethink my thoughts,
Sure.
or whatever I'm suggesting, right? But I think it's a balance, right? And if it's something where, like, it's going to cost money or cost us time, then you rein it in. You're like, hey, but I think there's a creative way to do it in such a way that you park your ego, but you are sort of passively aggressive and controlling kind of the outcome.
Right.
So,
Yeah, what do you guys think? That's a good assessment.
You're leading people to discover the answer for themselves by asking, smart, strategic questions.
So what do you think? How do you know when your ego or someone's ego is basically contributing to the success, or hurting the potential of success?
Well, I guess one of the ways is yours is the only voice you're hearing and listening to.
Sure. Yeah.
You're dominating the conversation, to your point, rather than learning what you can from every person in the room, whatever you can learn from them. Having that attitude of I guess serving is probably the best way I could put it.
or being open-minded.
The best leaders everywhere always come from the viewpoint of serving others, right? Putting the best group around them to help them serve others, right? And I think when you have that kind of attitude, it naturally leads to you checking your ego. Whether the initiative is successful or not, the ego checking is largely done when you take that kind of perspective.
So a few years ago, I got a job as a manager. The company wasn't doing very well. The team wasn't doing very well. They had kind of clean house of the leadership that was there before, and there was a lot of new staff who came in, and there was some old staff. And the company, I was hired with the objective. I didn't know that line of business, but I was hired with the objective that as a leader, a person who's been managing, you need to come in and turn the ship around. And so my approach when I went in was, I made it very clear. I let them know my management experience, but this was a new line of business for me. And so I'm going to rely on you because you are the expert with this particular line of business to help guide me. And so my approach was, I left my ego at the door. I could have been like, this is how it's going to be. I want you to do A, B, C, D. But when we started having like daily meetings, touch points to talk about the deliverables and the successes that we had the day before, and what are the challenges that we want to tackle today, and just by getting their buy-in. And I think if you can tell if your ego or too much ego is hurting or helping the team based on how they're responding to you. So the question is, how can you tell if your ego is getting in the way of your team's success? If they're not engaging with you when you have a task that they may not want to do, that's how you're going to know your ego is getting in the way of your team's success.
True.
But if it's a reciprocal relationship where you're saying, hey, I didn't have all the answers. Sometimes I needed their input, and sometimes I would get ideas that I may not agree with. But I would, if they gave me a suggestion, I'm not going to take every one, but I will take some so that they know that their voice is being heard.
Right.
So I think that's how you can tell if your ego is getting in the way. Is it just your voice when you get in front of your team and you have a task?
Right.
Or are you asking for input, and then once you leave that meeting or that interaction, are they going out to then execute what you've asked them to do? If they're not doing it, then you know that you need to change your approach, because what you're saying and the direction you're giving isn't working.
Well said.